Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: Skin of the Mirror. When Sarah first stepped into the old antique shop, she hadn't expected anything to change her life. She was just passing through town on her way to her new apartment, trying to escape the memory of her last failed relationship, and this quaint little shop, tucked away on a forgotten street, seemed like a good place to kill some time. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, the scent of old wood and dust filling the air. The shelves were crowded with dusty trinkets, old books, and objects that seemed to hold secrets long forgotten. But one thing caught her eye almost immediately: a large, ornate mirror standing in the far corner, framed in dark, intricate wood. It wasn't like the other items in the store. It was different. Sarah found herself walking toward it without even thinking. As she stood before it, she could see nothing special, just her own reflection staring back at her, pale and tired from the long drive. Yet there was something about the way the mirror seemed to draw her in, something almost alive. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the glass. For a moment she hesitated, then touched the surface. The coldness of the mirror sent a shiver down her spine. But it wasn't just the temperature that was strange. The reflection, her reflection, seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. She jerked her hand back, eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right, miss?" A voice came from behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. An elderly woman stood at the counter, watching her with sharp, curious eyes. The woman's face was weathered, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked at Sarah, as if she knew something Sarah didn't. "I'm fine," Sarah said quickly, forcing a smile. She turned back to the mirror, but when she looked at her reflection, she could have sworn it was different this time, darker, like something was hiding behind her. She rubbed her eyes, convinced she was just tired, but when she looked again, the image was unchanged. The woman moved slowly across the room, her feet dragging with each step. "That mirror, it's not just a mirror," she said softly, her voice as fragile as paper. "It's a door. A door to something you don't want to know about." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the strange feeling creeping over her. "I'm sure it's just an antique trick, right?" The woman's eyes darkened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Thomas, it's not a trick. And if you aren't careful, it will show you things you wish you could forget." Sarah turned back to the mirror, her fingers twitching as though they wanted to reach out again. But she resisted the urge. Instead, she smiled politely, paid for a small trinket she hadn't really wanted, and left the store as quickly as she could. It wasn't until she was driving away, the strange sensation of unease still lingering in her chest, that she realized what had been bothering her. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just dark, it was wrong. Her reflection had smiled. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah had settled into her new apartment, unpacking boxes and adjusting to her new life. The mirror, however, stayed in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to her. She even found herself walking down the street to the antique shop again, her feet moving on their own, despite every part of her telling her to turn back. When she arrived, the bell above the door jingled again, but this time it was different. The air was heavier, almost thick with something unseen. The shop was empty, and the woman who had been there before was nowhere to be found. It was as if the place had been abandoned. But the mirror, it was still there, standing in the corner like a silent sentinel, its surface gleaming with an unnatural shine. Sarah approached it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the glass once more. This time, the reflection didn't ripple. It stretched. She pulled her hand back in shock, but the reflection didn't change. The face staring back at her had the same dark, hollow look it had before. But there was something else now, something darker that seemed to crawl just beneath the surface of the glass. She stepped closer, drawn to it against her will. And then, something moved. In the reflection, something behind her shifted. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty shop. The air felt colder now, a chill creeping into her bones. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was there, standing behind her, just out of reach. A tall, shadowy figure, with eyes as dark as the void. The reflection of herself, no, something, smiled again, and Sarah's stomach twisted in terror. This wasn't her reflection. This wasn't real. Before she could react, the mirror began to hum softly, as though it were alive. The figure in the reflection moved toward her, its eyes burning with an intensity that felt like they were piercing through her very soul. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash. Sarah screamed. The next thing Sarah knew, she was back in her apartment. She didn't remember how she had gotten there. Her hands were trembling, her heart racing, and she could feel the lingering presence of something watching her. The mirror. It was in her living room. It stood there in the corner as though it had always been there. But this time, it wasn't the antique mirror she had touched at the shop. This one was different. The glass was cloudy, and the edges were cracked, as though something had tried to break through. The reflection inside seemed to move, no, shift, in ways that made her stomach churn. The figure was there again, standing just behind her, its eyes glowing with malice. "Leave me alone," Sarah whispered, but her voice was weak, barely a sound in the silent room. The reflection grinned. And then the glass began to crack. Sarah couldn't move. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The cracks in the mirror spread like veins, reaching outward, until the entire surface was a web of fractured glass. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the cracks stopped. The mirror was still. But something was wrong. From the shattered edges of the glass, something was reaching out, its fingers sliding through the cracks, its long, bony hand stretching toward her. Her breath hitched in terror. She couldn't look away. The hand moved faster now, and before she could react, it grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her toward the mirror with a strength that felt inhuman. Her scream was cut off as the glass shattered completely, and she was pulled into the cold, dark abyss. And as the room fell silent, the last thing Sarah saw was her own reflection, smiling. When Sarah woke up, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a restful night. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like the world had held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. She was lying on the cold, damp ground. The smell of earth and decay filled her nostrils, and her limbs ached as though they had been twisted in ways they weren't meant to bend. She tried to move, but her body was stiff, as though it had been asleep for far too long. When she finally forced her eyes open, she was greeted by nothing but darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows everything. But then, a faint light began to flicker, dim at first, like the glow of a distant candle. Sarah squinted, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in her apartment or the antique shop. No, this place felt old, ancient. The walls were made of crumbling stone, and the air was thick with dust. There was a strange, metallic taste in her mouth, and her heart pounded as she realized she wasn't alone. In the distance, a figure stood motionless, staring at her. It was hard to make out the details, but she could see its outline, tall and thin, like a shadow stretched too far. Her throat tightened. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice weak and cracked, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. Instead, another sound reached her ears, a low, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. It echoed through the cavernous space, getting closer and closer, until the figure was no longer a shadow, but a man. Or something like a man. His face was pale, his skin drawn tight, almost translucent, and his eyes were too wide, hollow and empty, as though they had never known warmth or kindness. His mouth was twisted into a permanent, unnatural grin. Sarah recoiled instinctively, her body crawling backward even though she didn't know where to go. The creature, didn't speak. He only tilted his head slightly, as though studying her with an unsettling curiosity. And then he moved, but it wasn't in a natural way. He didn't walk. He glided, his feet barely brushing the ground as he approached her with unnatural speed. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She scrambled to her feet, but the space around her seemed to stretch farther, growing endless. No matter which direction she tried to run, the walls closed in, suffocating her. The creature was right behind her now, his cold breath brushing against her neck, and she could hear his whispering voice, too soft to understand, but loud enough to feel it scrape against her mind. With every step, the shadows seemed to grow darker. The air grew heavier, thicker. She was trapped in some kind of nightmare, a place where time didn't exist, and the rules of reality had stopped making sense. The figure's smile widened, stretching impossibly wide, and his voice came again, clearer this time. "You thought you could escape, but you never leave, Sarah. Not once you've been touched by the mirror." Terror seized her chest. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on something unseen. She fell, and the ground beneath her felt wrong. It was soft, almost like it was alive, breathing beneath her. She scrambled to get up, but her hands sank into the surface. She looked down. The ground was made of flesh, the skin of the mirror, the walls, the floor, the very air seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though the mirror itself was consuming her, drawing her into its dark, twisted world. She felt the walls closing in, the skin of the mirror creeping around her, suffocating her. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken, her tears mingling with the cold sweat on her skin. "I don't belong here. I didn't mean to." The creature's grin was now so wide it almost looked like it could swallow her whole. "Oh, but you do, Sarah," it said, its voice filled with sickening pleasure. "You wanted to know what was behind the glass. You wanted to see the truth. But now, you belong to it." A sharp, jagged pain erupted in Sarah's chest as the mirror world around her seemed to tear at her insides. The reflection of the creature bent toward her, and for the first time, she saw something else, something beyond the monster. There, in the depths of the reflection, she saw herself, her true self, a hollow, broken version of her, her body twisted and cracked like a shattered piece of glass. Her eyes were wide, like the creature's, empty and lost. She could see herself reaching out, screaming silently, trapped within the skin of the mirror. The creature let out a low, terrifying laugh. "You're already here, Sarah. You always have been." And with that, the world around her shattered. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the world felt different. She was no longer in the flesh-filled, nightmarish space. She was back in her apartment, sitting on the floor in front of the broken mirror. It was shattered, its pieces scattered across the room like jagged teeth, but there was something even more unsettling than the mess. The air was still thick with something she couldn't name. The room felt of. Her body was trembling, but she wasn't sure if it was fear or something worse. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in something slick, dark red, like blood, but it wasn't hers. She had been changed. No longer just a reflection of herself, she could feel the weight of the mirror's grip, the skin of the mirror still tugging at her, pulling at the edges of her mind. She could see the dark eyes of the creature in the fragments of glass scattered across the room, watching her, waiting. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized she wasn't alone. The mirror wasn't just a door, it was a prison. And it wasn't done with her. Something in the broken glass shifted. Something reached for her again. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.